At my sister's wedding, she handed me a toilet brush and told me to get scrubbing because the help didn't show up. But when the venue manager pulled me aside and called me by a name I'd never told my family, everything changed. My name is Maya Chen, and this is the story of how cleaning bathrooms at my sister's wedding led to the most satisfying moment of my life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of Jessica's wedding dawned crisp and clear in Denver, with the kind of golden sunlight that makes everything look like it belongs in a magazine. I stood in the parking lot of Riverside Manor, staring up at the towering stone facade and perfectly manicured gardens, wondering why my stomach felt like it was full of lead. This should have been a happy day. My sister was marrying Brandon Williams, a successful attorney from one of Denver's most prominent families. The venue was stunning. The guest list was impressive, and everything had been planned to perfection. But as I walked through the ornate front doors carrying the emergency kit my mother had assigned me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into another carefully orchestrated reminder of exactly where I stood in the Chen family hierarchy. The marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and the scent of white roses filled the air. Staff members in crisp uniforms moved efficiently through the space, setting up chairs and adjusting floral arrangements. It was beautiful, expensive, and completely Jessica's style. I found my sister in the bridal suite, surrounded by her 4 bridesmaids and our mother, Linda. Jessica sat in front of an ornate mirror while a makeup artist applied the final touches to her already flawless face. Her wedding dress, a custom creation that had cost more than I made in 6 months, hung nearby like a work of art. The room buzzed with excited chatter and the soft clink of champagne glasses. Jessica caught my reflection in the mirror and turned, slightly. "Maya, perfect timing. I need you to handle something." Her voice had that particular tone she used when she was about to assign me a task that everyone else would consider beneath them. The bridesmaids, all daughters of Denver's social elite, continued their conversation about vacation homes and charity galas, without acknowledging my presence. "What do you need?" I asked, setting down the emergency kit on a nearby table. Our mother, Linda, looked up from her phone where she was undoubtedly posting updates about the wedding preparations. She wore a dove gray dress that probably cost more than my rent, and had her hair styled in an elaborate updo that screamed mother of the bride. "There's been a situation," Jessica said, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against the arm of her chair. "The cleaning crew for the venue had some kind of mix-up this morning. Half of them didn't show up, and the bathrooms aren't ready for guests. The ceremony starts in 3 hours. I waited for her to continue, already sensing where this was heading. The venue manager is scrambling to find replacement staff, but you know how these things go. We can't have dirty bathrooms when the Williamses and their friends arrive." Jessica's tone was matter-of-fact, as if she was discussing the weather rather than asking me to spend my sister's wedding day scrubbing toilets. One of the bridesmaids, a blonde named Courtney, whom I'd met exactly twice, looked up from her phone. "Oh my God, Jess, that's such a nightmare. What are you going to do?" Her voice was full of sympathy, but I noticed she didn't volunteer to help solve the problem. "Maya's going to take care of it," Jessica said simply. "She's always been good at fixing things behind the scenes." The makeup artist continued working, carefully applying lip gloss while my sister spoke. Our mother nodded approvingly, as if this was the most natural solution in the world. I felt my throat tighten, but I kept my voice steady. "You want me to clean the bathrooms at your wedding?" The words came out more incredulous than I intended, and I immediately regretted the tone. Jessica's eyes met mine in the mirror, and I saw a flash of irritation cross her features. "It's not ideal, Maya, but we're in a bind here. You're the only one who doesn't need to get ready, and honestly, you've always been more practical than the rest of us." Jessica's voice took on a slightly condescending edge that I recognized from our childhood. She had a gift for making her requests sound like compliments while simultaneously making it clear that refusing wasn't really an option. Linda set down her phone and looked at me with the expression she reserved for moments when I wasn't living up to the family's standards. Maya, darling, this is Jessica's special day. We all need to pitch in wherever we can. Besides, it's not like you'll be missing anything important during the setup. The bridesmaids exchanged glances, and I could see them trying not to smirk. To them, I was just Jessica's younger sister, who worked at some non-profit downtown and lived in a small apartment, instead of the family estate in Littleton. They probably assumed I was used to doing the dirty work. The venue has cleaning supplies, Jessica continued, turning back to the mirror as the makeup artist started on her eyes. And there are uniforms in the staff area if you want to blend in. Just make sure everything is spotless before the guests start arriving. As I worked, I thought about the conversation I'd overheard and realized that even the wedding guests could see how my family treated me. The humiliation wasn't just private anymore. It was on display for Denver's social elite to whisper about, in hallways. The cleaning cart wheels squeaked slightly as I pushed it back toward the staff area, passing servers who nodded politely and vendors who smiled with the professional courtesy reserved for fellow workers. None of them knew I was supposed to be a guest at this wedding. To them, I was just another member of the staff, doing my job and staying invisible. As I rounded the corner near the kitchen, I nearly collided with a tall man in an expensive suit who was studying something on his phone. He looked up, startled, and I immediately recognized him as Mr. Thompson, the venue manager I'd heard Jessica mention during the planning process. He was younger than I'd expected, probably in his early 40s, with sharp features and the kind of confident bearing that came from running high-end events. "I'm sorry," I said, maneuvering the cart to give him space to pass. He glanced at me, then at the cart, and his expression shifted slightly. For a moment, I thought he was going to compliment the cleaning job or ask about the bathroom situation, but instead, he tilted his head and studied my face with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Excuse me?" he said slowly, his voice carrying a note of confusion. "Are you Maya Chen?" The question caught me completely off guard. I expected him to know Jessica's name, maybe even our parents, but I couldn't imagine why the venue manager would know who I was. "Yes," I answered cautiously, wondering if Jessica had mentioned me in the context of the bathroom emergency. Mr. Thompson's expression shifted from confusion to something that looked almost like embarrassment. He glanced around the hallway, then back at me, clearly processing something that didn't make sense to him. "Maya Chen from Mountain View Development Group?" he asked, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "The leader of the investment consortium that's been working on the downtown revitalization project?" I felt my blood pressure spike as the two worlds I'd been keeping carefully separate suddenly collided in the most unexpected way possible. I stood there in my cleaning uniform, holding a bottle of bathroom cleaner, while the venue manager of my sister's wedding venue identified me as the head of one of Denver's most influential development groups. The irony was so complete it was almost funny. Almost. The expression on Mr. Thompson's face was shifting rapidly from confusion to mortification as he began to understand the situation. "Ms. Chen, I had no idea you were—" He gestured helplessly. "At my uniform and the cleaning cart. I mean, when your family booked the venue, we were told you might be attending, but no one mentioned. That I'd be the one cleaning your bathrooms?" I finished quietly, surprised by how calm my voice sounded despite the chaos in my head. Mr. Thompson's face flushed red, and he looked around the hallway again as if checking to make sure no one else was witnessing this conversation. "This is extremely embarrassing," he said, running a hand through his hair. "Ms. Chen, I've been working with your development group for 8 months on the Riverside Commons project. Your investment strategy for the downtown corridor has been brilliant. I never would have imagined." He trailed off, clearly at a loss for words. I set down the cleaning supplies I was holding and looked him directly in the eye. "Mr. Thompson, I think we need to have a conversation, but not here, and definitely not while I'm dressed like this." His relief was visible as he nodded quickly. Of course, absolutely. There's a private office upstairs we can use, but first, can I ask, does your family know about your business ventures? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The question was delicate, but I could see him trying to piece together how the head of a multi-million-dollar investment group ended up scrubbing toilets at her sister's wedding. No, I said simply. They don't. And until today, I preferred it that way. Mr. Thompson nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. He gestured toward a service elevator at the end of the hallway. Why don't you get changed, and then we'll talk. There are some things you should probably know about this venue and your family's event today. His tone had shifted completely from the professional politeness he might use with regular staff to the respectful deference he clearly felt he owed to a major business partner. As we walked toward the elevator, I felt something fundamental shifting in my chest. For the first time in years, someone was seeing me for who I really was instead of who my family expected me to be. The cleaning cart rolled behind us, forgotten, while I prepared to step out of the shadows I'd been hiding in for far too long. The private office Mr. Thompson led me to was elegant but functional, with windows overlooking the gardens where guests would soon be gathering for the ceremony. I had changed back into my original dress, a simple but well-tailored navy blue piece that I'd chosen specifically because it wouldn't draw attention from Jessica's bridal party. Now, sitting across from the venue manager who knew me by my professional reputation, the dress felt like armor. Mr. Thompson poured 2 glasses of water from a pitcher on the side table and settled into the chair across from me. Ms. Chen, I have to say, this situation is unprecedented. In 15 years of managing high-end events, I've never encountered anything quite like this. His tone was careful, professional, but I could see the genuine concern in his eyes. I can imagine, I replied, accepting the water. Gratefully. My throat felt dry, and I realized that the adrenaline from the unexpected encounter was finally starting to catch up with me. Mr. Thompson, what you said about the Riverside Commons project. How much does that involve today's venue? He leaned forward slightly, his expression becoming more serious. That's actually what I wanted to discuss with you. Riverside Manor is the cornerstone property for the entire development plan. Your investment group doesn't just hold the financing for the surrounding buildings. You hold the option to purchase this venue when the current ownership contract expires next month. The water glass stopped halfway to my lips. I knew about the downtown development project, of course. I'd been leading the investment consortium for over a year, carefully building a portfolio of properties that would transform Denver's business district. But I hadn't realized that today's wedding venue was part of that portfolio. Which means, Mr. Thompson continued, that you're essentially my future boss. The current owners are retiring, and Mountain View Development Group is set to take over operations. I've been preparing transition reports for you for weeks. He paused, shaking his head slightly. I just never imagined I'd meet you while you were cleaning our bathrooms. The irony of the situation was becoming more surreal by the minute. My sister had chosen this venue specifically because it represented the pinnacle of Denver society, the kind of place where important people held important events. She had no idea that her despised younger sister was about to own it. I set down the water glass and looked out the window at the gardens below. Guests were beginning to arrive. Elegant figures in designer clothing stepping out of luxury cars and walking slowly toward the ceremony space. Among them, I could see members of the Williams family, Denver's legal and business elite, the very people whose approval my parents had always craved. Mr. Thompson, I said slowly, turning back to face him, what would happen if I decided to exercise that purchase option today? He blinked, clearly not expecting the question. Today? Well, technically the paperwork could be expedited, but it would be highly unusual to complete a property transfer on the same day as a major event. There would be insurance considerations, liability issues. He paused, studying my expression. May I ask why you're considering such immediate action? I thought about the conversation I'd overheard in the hallway, about the guests whispering about the Chen girl cleaning toilets. I thought about my sister's casual dismissal of my dignity and my parents' assumption that I would always be available to handle whatever task was beneath them. Most of all, I thought about the years I'd spent building a successful business while my family treated me like an afterthought. Because, Mr. Thompson, I'm tired of being invisible in my own life. And sometimes the best way to become visible is to change the entire landscape. He nodded slowly, a hint of understanding and perhaps admiration crossing his features. Ms. Chen, if you're serious about this, I should mention that there's a clause in the current ownership agreement that would allow for immediate transfer under certain circumstances. Emergency sale provisions, intended to protect the business in case of financial distress. It's unusual, but not impossible. I felt a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth for the first time all day. And what would such a transfer mean for today's event? Mr. Thompson's answering smile was carefully professional, but I could see a spark of interest in his eyes. Well, the new owner would have complete authority over venue operations, including ongoing events. They could choose to honor existing arrangements or make modifications as they saw fit. His tone was neutral, but the implication was clear. I stood up and walked to the window, watching as more guests arrived and staff members made final preparations for the ceremony. Somewhere in the building below, Jessica was probably having her final dress fitting, while our parents ensured that every detail met their exacting standards. None of them had any idea that the woman they'd sent to clean bathrooms was about to become the owner of their perfect venue. Mr. Thompson, I said, turning back to face him. Let's talk about those emergency sale provisions. I think it's time for Mountain View Development Group to accelerate its timeline. The next hour passed in a blur of phone calls, document reviews, and carefully worded legal discussions. Mr. Thompson had summoned his assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia, who seemed to materialize contracts and financial statements from thin air. As I sat in the venue's private office, signing papers that would transfer ownership of Riverside Manor to Mountain View Development Group, I could hear the distant sounds of wedding preparations continuing below. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from my legal team and financial advisors, all expressing varying degrees of surprise at the accelerated timeline, but working efficiently to make it happen. The beauty of having built a legitimate, well-funded investment group was that when you decided to move quickly, the infrastructure was already in place to support that decision. Patricia handed me the final set of documents, her expression professionally neutral despite what must have been an extraordinary situation for her. The transfer is complete, Ms. Chen. Riverside Manor is now officially owned and operated by Mountain View Development Group, effective immediately. All existing contracts and agreements remain in force, but ultimate authority rests with you. I signed my name with the same pen I'd used countless times in boardrooms across Denver, but this signature felt different. This wasn't just another business acquisition. This was the moment I stopped being the invisible Chen daughter and started being exactly who I'd built myself to become. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat gently. Ms. Chen, I should mention that as the new owner, you have the right to make immediate, operational decisions. However, given that there's a major event currently in progress, I wanted to discuss how you'd like to proceed. His tone was carefully diplomatic, but I could see the anticipation in his eyes. I stood up and smoothed my dress, feeling a strange calm settle over me. For the first time in my adult life, I held complete control over a situation involving my family, and the feeling was both terrifying and exhilarating. Mr. Thompson, I'd like to inspect the property as the new owner. All of it, including the areas currently being used for today's event. Of course, he replied immediately. Would you like me to announce the ownership change to the current event organizers? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications. I could choose to keep this quiet, to let Jessica's wedding proceed without anyone knowing that the venue now belonged to me. Or I could step out of the shadows I'd been hiding in for years. Not yet, I said finally. I'd like to observe for a while first. Sometimes you learn the most about people when they think no one important is watching. Mr. Thompson nodded, understanding flickering in his expression. We left the office and began a tour of the property that felt surreal in its completeness. As the new owner, I saw spaces that had been off-limits to me as a mere family member. The commercial kitchen where my sister's expensive catering was being prepared, the wine cellar where bottles worth more than my monthly salary were stored, the bridal suite where Jessica was undoubtedly putting finishing touches on her perfect appearance. In the main event space, I watched my parents directing staff with the authority of people accustomed to being obeyed. My father, Robert, stood near the altar arrangement, critiquing the placement of white roses while the florist nodded deferentially. My mother, Linda, supervised the seating arrangements with the precision of a military strategist, ensuring that the most important guests would be positioned for optimal photo opportunities. Neither of them had asked where I was or whether the bathroom situation had been resolved. In their world, problems like that simply disappeared when assigned to the right person, and I had always been that person. The realization that they hadn't even thought about me since I'd left the bridal suite hours earlier was somehow more painful than any direct insult. Jessica emerged from the bridal suite looking radiant, her dress trailing behind her like something from a fairy tale. The photographer immediately began capturing her descent down the grand staircase while her bridesmaids followed at a carefully calculated distance. She moved with the confidence of someone who had never doubted that she deserved to be the center of attention, never questioned whether the world would rearrange itself to showcase her happiness. Mr. Thompson and I observed from a discreet alcove as the photographer directed the bridal party through a series of poses. Jessica's laugh carried across the space, bright and musical, the sound of someone who had never been asked to clean a toilet at her own sister's wedding. The contrast between her current radiance and my morning spent scrubbing bathroom fixtures felt stark and deliberate. Brandon Williams appeared, looking every inch the successful attorney in his perfectly tailored tuxedo. He greeted Jessica with the kind of smile that photographers love to capture, and I watched my parents beam with pride at their future son-in-law. The Williams family represented everything my parents had always wanted: established wealth, social connections, and the kind of respectability that came from generations of success. As I watched this tableau of family perfection, I noticed something that might have escaped someone who didn't know the players involved. Jessica's smiles were just a little too bright, her laughter just a little too frequent. Brandon's attention seemed to wander when he thought no one was looking, and his responses to her comments carried the polite distance of someone going through familiar motions. More interesting was the interaction between our parents and the Williams family patriarch, Judge William Williams, Brandon's father. The judge was polite, but cool, offering the minimal warmth required by social convention. His wife, Margaret, made conversation with my mother, but I could see the subtle signs of someone fulfilling an obligation rather than enjoying a connection. Mr. Thompson leaned closer to me, speaking in a low voice. The Williams family has been members here for 3 generations. Judge Williams was quite particular about maintaining the venue's traditional standards when we discussed today's event. He seemed very concerned about the appropriateness of the families involved. The implication was clear. The Williams family had reservations about their son marrying into the Chen family despite our wealth and social pretensions. We were new money, immigrants who had built success through hard work rather than inheritance, and that distinction mattered in Denver's established social circles. I thought about the irony of the situation. While my parents worked desperately to prove their worthiness to the Williams family, I had quietly built exactly the kind of generational wealth and influence that they respected. Mountain View Development Group wasn't just successful. It was reshaping Denver's economic landscape in ways that would matter for decades. The ceremony began precisely on schedule, with guests seated according to my mother's meticulous plan. I stood at the back of the space, no longer in my cleaning uniform, but still invisible to most of the attendees. From this vantage point, I could see everything: the careful choreography of the processional, the practiced smiles of the bridal party, the polite attention of guests who were there more for social obligation than genuine celebration. Jessica walked down the aisle on our father's arm, and I had to admit she looked beautiful. The dress fit her perfectly, the flowers were stunning, and the late afternoon light streaming through the venue's windows created a magical atmosphere. For a moment, I felt a pang of the sisterly affection that had existed between us before. Family dynamics and parental favoritism had driven us apart. But then I remembered the morning's bathroom assignment and the casual way she had dismissed my dignity. I thought about years of being treated as the family problem solver while she collected praise for simply existing in the role of golden child. The moment of sentimentality passed, replaced by the cold clarity that had carried me through the property acquisition. The ceremony proceeded with all the traditional elements: readings about love and commitment, vows that sounded beautiful but felt rehearsed, rings exchanged with perfect timing for the photographer. Judge Williams performed the service with professional competence, but I noticed he kept his remarks generic, avoiding the personal touches that usually characterize family weddings. When Brandon kissed Jessica at the conclusion of the ceremony, the guests applauded with appropriate enthusiasm. My parents looked radiant with pride, finally achieving the social validation they had pursued for years. The Williams family smiled and nodded, fulfilling their obligations with grace, if not warmth. As the newly married couple walked back down the aisle, Jessica's eyes found mine in the crowd. For just a moment, her perfect smile faltered, and I saw something that might have been guilt or uncertainty cross her features. But then Brandon said something that made her laugh, and the moment passed. She was back to being the radiant bride, surrounded by love and luxury, while I remained the sister who had cleaned bathrooms to make her day perfect. The cocktail hour began immediately after the ceremony, with guests moving to the terrace for drinks and appetizers. I watched the careful social choreography from inside the venue, noting how conversations formed and reformed based on business connections and social hierarchies. The Williams family held court near the bar, while my parents worked the room with the determined efficiency of people trying to solidify their new position. Mr. Thompson appeared beside me, carrying a tablet that displayed what looked like financial reports. "Ms. Chen, I thought you might want to see the revenue projections for today's event. Between the venue rental, catering, bar service, and additional fees, today's wedding represents approximately $150,000 in gross revenue." I studied the numbers, noting the breakdown of costs and profit margins. "Your sister's wedding is actually one of our largest events this quarter. The Williams family specifically requested our premium package, which includes services and amenities that we typically reserve for corporate retreats and high-profile galas." The irony wasn't lost on me. Jessica's perfect wedding, the event my parents had used to demonstrate their family's worthiness to Denver society, was now generating revenue for my business. Every expensive detail, from the imported flowers to the custom menu, was contributing to my bottom line. I handed the tablet back to Mr. Thompson and made a decision that felt both inevitable and liberating. "I think it's time to make some changes to today's event schedule. As the new owner, I have some announcements to make, and I can't think of a better audience than Denver's social elite." His eyebrows rose slightly, but his tone remained professional. "What kind of announcements, Ms. Chen, and how would you like me to facilitate them?" I could see him calculating the potential impact of whatever I was planning, probably wondering if his new boss was about to create a scandal that would affect the venue's reputation. I smiled, feeling genuinely happy for the first time all day. "Mr. Thompson, I think it's time for the Chen family to learn exactly who they've been taking for granted all these years. And I think Judge Williams and his friends should meet the real power behind Denver's downtown development." The conversation was interrupted by commotion near the bar. Raised voices carried across the terrace, and I could see my father gesturing animatedly while talking to a man I recognized as one of Brandon's groomsmen. Other guests were beginning to notice the disturbance, turning their attention toward what appeared to be an increasingly heated discussion. Mr. Thompson and I moved closer, using the crowd for cover as we tried to understand what was happening. The groomsman, a lawyer named Kenneth who worked at Brandon's firm, was speaking in the loud, confident voice of someone who had consumed several cocktails and lost his social filter. "I'm just saying," Kenneth declared, gesturing with his gin and tonic, "that some families work harder to get into these circles than others. There's a difference between earning your place and buying your way in." His words carried the casual cruelty of someone who had never questioned his own privilege. My father's face had gone red, and I could see him struggling to maintain the composure that was so important to his social image. "The Williams family has always been gracious to us, Robert," replied stiffly. "We're honored to be joining their family through this marriage." Kenneth laughed, the sound sharp and ugly in the elegant setting. "Oh, come on, Robert. Everyone knows Brandon could have done better. This is about business connections, not romance. Your daughter is pretty enough, but let's not pretend this is some great love story." The words hung in the air like a slap, and I felt my own anger rising on behalf of my family despite everything that had happened between us. Whatever Jessica's faults, she didn't deserve to have her marriage reduced to a business transaction by some drunk lawyer at her own wedding reception. My mother appeared beside my father, her face pale but determined. "I think you've had enough to drink, Kenneth," she said with forced politeness. "Perhaps you should get some air." But Kenneth was beyond the reach of social cues, emboldened by alcohol and the immunity that came from being part of the Williams family circle. "The truth is," he continued, swaying slightly as he spoke, "that families like yours always think you can buy respectability. But breeding shows, you know? You can put on all the charity galas and society events you want, but Denver's old families can always tell the difference." I felt Mr. Thompson tense beside me, probably anticipating the kind of scene that could permanently damage the venue's reputation. Other guests were starting to stare openly now, drawn by the increasingly ugly confrontation. Jessica and Brandon were still engaged with the photographer, but it was only a matter of time before they became aware of the drama unfolding at their reception. That was the moment I realized I couldn't wait any longer to reveal who I really was. My family might have treated me terribly, but I wasn't going to stand by and watch them be humiliated by someone whose only claim to superiority was an accident of birth. It was time to remind everyone in attendance that power came in many forms, and sometimes the most dangerous opponents were the ones you never saw coming. I straightened my shoulders and began walking toward the confrontation, feeling the weight of Riverside Manor's ownership in every step. Behind me, Mr. Thompson followed, understanding that whatever happened next would reshape the entire dynamic of this carefully orchestrated social event. The time for invisibility was over. It was time for the real Maya Chen to make her entrance. I walked through the crowd with deliberate calm, each step carrying the authority I'd been hiding for years. The conversations around me continued, but I could feel the subtle shift in attention as people noticed my approach. Kenneth was still holding court near the bar, his voice growing louder and more belligerent as he continued his drunken commentary on social hierarchies and family worth. My parents stood frozen in mortification, clearly torn between defending themselves and avoiding a scene that would draw more attention to Kenneth's cruel observations. Other guests pretended to be engaged in their own conversations while obviously listening to every word, the kind of social disaster that would be discussed in Denver's elite circles for months. Mr. Thompson materialized beside me, speaking quietly into a small headset that connected him to his staff throughout the venue. "Security is in position. If needed, Ms. Chen, how would you like to proceed?" His professionalism was impeccable, but I could hear the tension in his voice. Managing high-end events meant preventing exactly this type of confrontation from escalating. I approached the group around Kenneth with the measured pace I'd learned in boardrooms where million-dollar decisions were made daily. My father noticed me first, his expression shifting from embarrassment to confusion as he tried to understand why I was inserting myself into an already volatile situation. "Kenneth?" I said pleasantly, extending my hand as if we were meeting for the first time. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. I'm Maya Chen." He looked down at my outstretched hand with the dismissive glance reserved for people he considered beneath his notice. "Oh, the other Chen daughter," he said with mock recognition. "I heard you were here somewhere." "Doing what exactly? Helping with the catering?" His laugh was designed to wound, and I could see my parents wince at the casual cruelty of his assumption. "Actually," I replied, maintaining my pleasant tone, "I've been getting acquainted with the property. It's a beautiful venue, don't you think? The gardens alone must be worth a fortune in this market." Kenneth nodded absently, clearly not interested in discussing real estate with someone he'd already categorized as unimportant. My mother stepped closer, probably hoping to deflect Kenneth's attention away from me and minimize whatever damage my presence might cause. "Maya has always been interested in property values," she said with forced lightness. "It's one of her hobbies." The word hobby stung more than Kenneth's insults because it came from my own mother. Years of building a successful business empire, reduced to a casual pastime that could be mentioned and dismissed in the same breath. I felt my resolve crystallize into something harder and more focused than anger. "A hobby," I repeated thoughtfully. "That's an interesting way to describe it." Mr. Thompson, who had been standing discreetly nearby, moved closer at my subtle gesture. "Kenneth, since you seem so interested in family qualifications and business credentials, perhaps you'd like to hear about my actual profession." Kenneth turned toward me with the condescending attention adults give to children who insist on telling long, pointless stories. "Sure, sweetheart. What is it you think you do?" The endearment was delivered with enough venom to kill, but I smiled as if he'd offered a genuine compliment. "I run Mountain View Development Group," I said simply. "We're the investment consortium that's been transforming Denver's downtown corridor for the past 2 years. Perhaps you've heard of us? We recently acquired several historic properties and have been working with the city on sustainable urban development." Kenneth's expression didn't change immediately. He clearly wasn't familiar with my company's name, which told me everything. I needed to know about how closely he followed Denver's actual business landscape versus its social gossip. But I could see recognition dawning in the faces of other guests who had been drawn to our conversation. Judge Williams, who had been observing from a few feet away, stepped forward with the sharp attention of someone who suddenly understood they were dealing with a different situation than they'd assumed. "Mountain View Development Group," he repeated slowly. "You're the group that holds the financing for the Riverside Commons project." "That's correct, Your Honor," I replied, noting how his entire demeanor shifted as he processed this information. "We've been working closely with the City Planning Commission and several local investors to create a mixed-use development that will serve as an anchor for downtown revitalization." Kenneth looked confused, glancing between me and Judge Williams, as if trying to understand why the conversation had taken a turn toward municipal policy. But my parents' faces were a study in dawning comprehension and horror. They were beginning to realize that their daughter, the one they'd sent to clean bathrooms that morning, was claiming to be the head of one of Denver's most influential development companies. My father cleared his throat nervously. "Maya, what exactly are you saying?" His voice carried the careful tone of someone trying to avoid a public embarrassment while desperately hoping for a reasonable explanation. "I'm saying, Dad, that while you and Mom have been trying to buy your way into Denver society through charity galas and social connections, I've been building the kind of generational wealth and influence that actually matters in this city. Mountain View Development Group doesn't just participate in Denver's growth, we direct it." The silence that followed was profound. Kenneth's gin and tonic stopped halfway to his mouth. Judge Williams studied me with the calculating attention of someone reassessing a chessboard, and my parents looked like they'd been struck by lightning. Around us, other conversations had quieted, as people strained to hear what was happening at the center of this unexpected drama. Mr. Thompson stepped forward with perfect timing, carrying the tablet that displayed Mountain View's financial portfolio. "Ms. Chen, you asked me to provide these quarterly reports for your review. The projected returns on the downtown corridor investments continue to exceed expectations." He handed me the tablet with the deference due to a major client, and I scrolled through the numbers with practiced ease. The visual of me reviewing multi-million-dollar financial projections was having exactly the impact I'd intended. Kenneth had gone pale, Judge Williams looked intrigued rather than dismissive, and my parents appeared to be questioning everything. They thought they knew about their younger daughter. Kenneth found his voice first, though it lacked the earlier confidence. "You're saying you run this investment group? How is that possible? You're what, 28? And I thought you worked at some nonprofit downtown." "I do work at a nonprofit," I confirmed, the Denver Community Foundation, where I manage their investment portfolio and coordinate funding for urban development projects. It's amazing how much you can accomplish when people underestimate you because they assume you're just cleaning up after everyone else. The reference to cleaning was deliberate, and I saw my mother flinch as she realized I was drawing a direct line between this morning's bathroom assignment and the broader pattern of how our family treated me. Kenneth looked like he was trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Judge Williams, however, was beginning to smile. The kind of smile that appeared when someone who understood power recognized it in an unexpected place. "Ms. Chen, I believe your group has been corresponding with my law firm about the legal framework for the Riverside Commons project. My partner, James Morrison, has mentioned you several times as someone who understands both the financial and regulatory complexities of urban development." "That's correct," I replied. "Mr. Morrison has been invaluable in navigating the zoning requirements and environmental impact assessments. Your firm's expertise in municipal law has been essential to our success." The conversation was taking on the tenor of a professional networking event, but with an undercurrent of social revolution that was lost on no one present. Here was Kenneth, who minutes earlier had been lecturing my family about buying their way into respectability, discovering that the woman he'd dismissed as hired help was actually more financially powerful than anyone at the reception. My mother stepped forward, her voice tight with confusion and what might have been fear. "Maya, why didn't you tell us about any of this? We had no idea you were involved in anything so significant." The word significant hung in the air like an accusation. After years of being treated as insignificant, it was fascinating to watch my mother grapple with the possibility that she'd been wrong about my worth and potential. But her question revealed the fundamental problem with our family dynamic. She wasn't asking why I'd built this success, only why I'd hidden it from them. "Because, Mom," I said gently, "every time I've tried to share anything important with this family, I've been reminded that Jessica's achievements matter more than mine. When I graduated summa cum laude from business school, you spent the celebration dinner talking about Jessica's new job. When I published my first paper on sustainable urban development, Dad used it as background reading for one of Jessica's presentations." I could see recognition and guilt warring in my mother's expression, but before she could respond, Jessica herself appeared at the edge of our circle. She still looked radiant in her wedding dress, but there was tension around her eyes as she approached the group that was clearly engaged in something more serious than cocktail party small talk. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. I could see her taking in the serious faces, Kenneth's pale complexion, and the tablet in my hands that displayed financial projections. "Your sister," Kenneth said weakly, "apparently runs some kind of investment company." He sounded like he was testing the words to see if they made sense when spoken aloud. Jessica looked at me with the patronizing smile she'd perfected over years of being the family's acknowledged success story. "Maya, What are you telling people? You know how these stories can get exaggerated at events like this. The dismissal was so automatic, so perfectly calibrated to put me back in my place, that I almost admired its efficiency. Even when presented with evidence that contradicted everything she believed about our relative positions in the world, Jessica's first instinct was to assume I was lying or exaggerating for attention. "Jessica," I said calmly, "I own this venue. As of 3 hours ago, Riverside Manor belongs to Mountain View Development Group, which means your wedding reception is taking place on my property, catered by my staff, and generating revenue for my business." The statement landed like a physical blow. Jessica's perfect smile faltered. Brandon appeared behind her looking confused, and my parents stared at me as if I'd announced I was from another planet. Even Judge Williams looked surprised, though I could see him rapidly recalculating the social and business implications of what I'd just revealed. Mr. Thompson chose that moment to approach with an official-looking document. "Ms. Chen, the final. Transfer paperwork has been completed. Riverside Manor is now officially operated under Mountain View Development Group's management." He handed me the document with a slight bow that emphasized the change in our relationship. I accepted the paperwork and held it so that the header was visible to everyone in our circle. The Mountain View Development Group letterhead was impressive, featuring the kind of corporate design that conveyed serious business credentials. More importantly, my name was clearly visible as Chief Executive Officer and Principal Investor. Jessica reached for the document, probably hoping to find some evidence that this was an elaborate joke or misunderstanding. But as she scanned the legal language and official seals, her expression shifted from disbelief to something approaching panic. "This says you bought the venue today," she said slowly. "During my wedding. How is that possible?" Her voice had risen, slightly, and I could see guests at nearby tables beginning to notice that something dramatic was happening at the center of the reception. "It's possible," I replied, "because I've spent the last 5 years building exactly the kind of business empire that can move quickly when opportunities arise. While you were planning this wedding to impress the Williams family, I was quietly becoming someone they actually need to impress." The reversal was complete and devastating. Kenneth, who had started the evening lecturing my family about their social inadequacy, was now in the position of having insulted one of Denver's most influential young business leaders. My parents, who had spent years prioritizing Jessica's achievements over mine, were confronting the reality that their dismissed daughter had surpassed both of their children in ways they'd never imagined. Most importantly, Jessica was discovering that her perfect wedding, the event that was supposed to cement her position as the family's golden child, was taking place at the discretion of the sister she'd sent to clean bathrooms that morning. Brandon, who had been listening with growing alarm, finally found his voice. "Maya, I think there may be some confusion here. This is Jessica's wedding day. Surely we can discuss business matters later, when the celebration is over." His attempt at diplomacy was understandable, but missed the essential point of what was happening. This wasn't about business. It was about years of accumulated slights and dismissals finally reaching a moment of reckoning. I smiled at Brandon with genuine sympathy, recognizing that he was caught in the middle of family dynamics he'd never been asked to understand. "Brandon, you're absolutely right that this is Jessica's wedding day," I agreed. "And I want it to be perfect for her. That's why I think it's time for some honest conversations about respect, family dynamics, and the difference between being important and being treated as important." I could see Mr. Thompson positioning his staff strategically around the terrace, ready to manage whatever happened next. The other guests were no longer pretending to ignore our conversation. They were openly watching what had become the evening's main entertainment. Denver's social elite was witnessing a family drama that would be discussed in private clubs and charity luncheons for years to come. The moment had arrived when I would either retreat back into invisibility or step fully into the power I'd built. Looking at my family's shocked faces, I realized there was only one choice that honored both the woman I'd become and the sister who had spent too many years cleaning up other people's messes. It was time to stop being the family's problem solver and start being their equal. The silence stretched across the terrace like a held breath. I could feel the weight of 200 pairs of eyes focused on our small circle, where the carefully maintained facade of the Chen family's social climbing had just collapsed in spectacular fashion. Jessica stood frozen in her wedding dress, the document trembling slightly in her manicured hands as she continued to process the impossible reality that her despised younger sister had just become her landlord. Judge Williams broke the silence first, his legal mind already working through the implications of what he'd witnessed. "Ms. Chen," he said with newfound respect, "I believe we need to have a much longer conversation about your development projects. Your approach to urban revitalization has been quite impressive, and I suspect there are opportunities for collaboration that we haven't explored." The transformation in his tone was remarkable. 20 minutes earlier, he'd been politely tolerating my family's presence at his son's wedding. Now he was actively courting a business relationship with the woman he'd probably assumed was peripheral to the evening's proceedings. Kenneth, standing beside him, looked like he was experiencing a form of social whiplash. My father stepped forward, his face a complex mixture of pride, confusion, and something that might have been fear. "Maya," he said carefully, "I think we need to discuss this. Privately, as a family." His emphasis on the word family carried both desperation and authority, as if invoking our blood relationship could somehow restore the balance of power that had just shifted so dramatically. "Actually, Dad," I replied evenly, "I think we've had enough private family discussions. Most of them seem to end with me being assigned tasks that are beneath everyone else's dignity." I gestured toward the elegant terrace around us. "At least here we have witnesses who can ensure everyone behaves civilly." My mother's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. "Maya, please," she said in a voice I rarely heard from her, one that actually contained genuine emotion rather than social calculation. "We can work this out. There's no need to make a scene at Jessica's wedding." The irony of her plea was perfect. After years of being told to avoid making scenes, to keep quiet, to handle problems discreetly, I was finally in a position where making a scene served my interests rather than theirs. But as I looked at my mother's stricken expression, I felt an unexpected pang of something that might have been sympathy. "I'm not making a scene, Mom," I said gently. "I'm just refusing to pretend that this morning didn't happen. That years of being treated like the family servant didn't happen. That being cropped out of photos and forgotten at events didn't happen." I gestured toward the beautiful reception around us. "This is Jessica's perfect day, and I want her to have it. But I also want her to understand exactly who made it possible." Jessica finally found her voice, though it came out higher and tighter than her usual confident tone. "Maya, I asked you to help with the bathrooms because there was an emergency." It wasn't personal, it was just practical. The word practical hung between us like a blade. Jessica had always been skilled at reframing her cruelty as pragmatism, making her demands sound reasonable while ensuring that I was always the one making sacrifices. But hearing her use that defense now, in front of Denver's social elite, crystallized everything that was wrong with our family dynamic. "Practical," I repeated thoughtfully. "You know what else would have been practical, Jessica? Asking your 4 bridesmaids to help, or hiring additional cleaning staff, or perhaps acknowledging that your sister deserved better than being handed a toilet brush at your wedding reception." I paused, letting the words settle. But those options weren't practical, because they would have required treating me with basic, human dignity. Brandon, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable as he watched his new wife's family implode in public, attempted to intervene again. "Maya, I'm sure Jessica didn't mean any disrespect. Wedding days are stressful, and sometimes people don't think clearly about how their requests might be received." His attempt at diplomacy was well-intentioned, but revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what was happening. This wasn't about wedding day stress or poor communication. This was about a lifetime of accumulated slights reaching a breaking point at exactly the moment when I finally had the power to address them. "Brandon," I said with genuine gentleness, "I appreciate that you're trying to mediate, but this isn't a misunderstanding that can be smoothed over with good intentions. This is about the fact that your new wife sent me to clean toilets this morning while she got pampered in a bridal suite, and neither she nor my parents saw anything wrong with that arrangement." I could see recognition dawning in Brandon's eyes, as he began to understand that he'd married into a family with dynamics he'd never been asked to examine. Judge Williams was watching his son with the sharp attention of someone evaluating how this revelation might affect his family's reputation and business interests. Mr. Thompson approached our group with the discreet efficiency that had made him successful in managing high-end events. "Ms. Chen," he said quietly, "the catering staff is ready to begin dinner service. Would you like me to proceed with the original schedule, or would you prefer to make any adjustments as the venue owner?" The question was perfectly professional, but it served to remind everyone present that I now controlled every aspect of the evening's proceedings. The flowers, the food, the music, the bar service, even the bathrooms I'd cleaned that morning were all under my authority. Jessica's perfect wedding continued at my discretion. Jessica's eyes widened as the full implications of the situation became clear to her. "Maya," she said urgently, "you can't seriously be considering disrupting my wedding because you're upset about cleaning bathrooms. That would be completely unreasonable." The word unreasonable struck me as particularly rich, coming from someone who had just spent the day treating her sister like hired help. But as I looked at Jessica in her beautiful dress, surrounded by guests who had traveled from across the country to celebrate her happiness, I realized that disrupting her wedding wouldn't serve my purposes or bring me the satisfaction I was seeking. "Jessica," I said calmly, "I have no intention of disrupting your wedding. You're going to have your perfect reception, your perfect dinner, and your perfect send-off. Every detail will proceed exactly as planned." I paused, watching relief begin to cross her features. "But you're going to have it while knowing that the sister you sent to clean bathrooms this morning is the reason any of this is possible. The psychological impact of my decision was more devastating than any disruption could have been." Jessica would spend her entire wedding reception knowing that every beautiful detail, every impressed guest comment, every moment of social triumph was happening because I allowed it. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that her gratitude had become a form of submission. My father cleared his throat, his business instincts finally engaging as he began to process the financial implications of what I'd revealed. "Maya," he said carefully, "perhaps we should discuss the details of your business ventures later. I'm sure there are ways the family could support your endeavors." The offer of support, coming after years of dismissal, would have been laughable if it weren't so transparently calculated. Now that I'd proven my worth in terms he could understand, my father was ready to claim credit for my success and find ways to benefit from it. The pattern was so familiar, it was almost comforting in its predictability. "Dad," I replied with a slight smile, "I appreciate the offer, but Mountain View Development Group has been quite successful without family support. In fact, we've been intentionally discreet about our operations specifically to avoid the kind of complications that arise when business and family relationships become entangled." Kenneth, who had been silent since his earlier humiliation, finally spoke up with the desperation of someone trying to salvage a catastrophic social situation. "Maya, I owe you an apology. I clearly didn't understand who I was talking to, and my comments were completely inappropriate." His apology was more about protecting himself than expressing genuine remorse, but I nodded graciously anyway. "Kenneth, apology accepted. Though I think the real lesson here isn't about understanding who you're talking to. It's about treating everyone with basic respect, regardless of their perceived status." The comment was directed at Kenneth, but its implications for my family were unmistakable. Around us, other guests had resumed their own conversations, though I could see them glancing in our direction and undoubtedly discussing what they'd witnessed. The story of the Chen family drama would spread through Denver's social circles within hours. Judge Williams stepped closer, his expression thoughtful. Ms. Chen, I'm curious about your long-term vision for the downtown development project. Urban revitalization efforts often face significant regulatory challenges, and I'd be interested in discussing how the legal framework might be optimized to support sustainable growth. His interest was genuine professional engagement, the kind of serious business conversation I'd been having with Denver's power brokers for months, while my family remained oblivious to my actual career. The contrast between his respectful attention and my family's years of dismissal was stark and satisfying. We're focused on creating mixed-use developments that serve both commercial and residential needs, I replied, shifting easily into the professional mode that felt more natural to me than family dynamics. The goal is to build spaces that support long-term community growth rather than just maximizing short-term profit margins. As I spoke about zoning requirements and environmental impact assessments, I could see my parents listening with expressions of amazement and confusion. They were hearing me discuss complex policy issues with one of Denver's most respected judges, demonstrating expertise in areas they'd never known I was interested in, much less qualified to address. Jessica stood beside Brandon, still holding the property transfer documents, her perfect wedding day now permanently associated with the revelation that her overlooked sister had become one of Denver's most influential young business leaders. Every photo from today would remind her of this moment. Every anniversary would carry the memory of learning that the woman she'd sent to clean bathrooms owned the venue where she'd promised to love and honor her husband. The dinner chimes sounded across the terrace, and Mr. Thompson approached with the practiced timing of someone who understood how to manage both logistics and psychology. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the assembled guests, "dinner is now served in the main dining room. Please make your way inside at your convenience." The announcement provided a natural break in the tension, allowing guests to move away from the epicenter of the Chen family revelation while giving everyone involved a chance to process what had happened. But as people began to drift toward the dining room, I realized that the most important conversations were just beginning. My mother approached me as the crowd thinned, her social mask finally dropping to reveal genuine emotion. "Maya," she said quietly, "I think we've made some terrible mistakes. I never realized that you were building something so impressive while we were focused on other things." The admission was more honest than anything she'd said to me in years, but it also revealed the fundamental problem with how my family measured worth. They weren't apologizing for treating me badly. They were apologizing for failing to recognize my value in terms they understood. The distinction mattered more than they realized. "Mom," I said gently, "the problem isn't that you didn't know about my business success. The problem is that you treated me like I didn't matter even when you thought I was just working at a nonprofit and living in a small apartment. My worth as your daughter shouldn't depend on my bank account or professional achievements." She blinked at me, clearly struggling to process a concept that challenged everything she believed about family hierarchies and social value. In her world, success justified respect, and failure warranted dismissal. The idea that I deserved basic dignity regardless of my accomplishments was foreign to everything she'd built her life around. Jessica approached as well, having finally handed the transfer documents to Brandon, who looked like he was still trying to understand how his wedding reception had become a referendum on business ethics and family dynamics. "Maya," she said carefully, "I want you to know that I never intended to hurt your feelings this morning." The careful phrasing was typical Jessica, acknowledging my emotional response while avoiding responsibility for her actions. She wasn't apologizing for sending me to clean bathrooms. She was expressing regret that I'd been hurt by it. The distinction revealed everything about how she viewed our relationship and her role in it. "Jessica," I replied, "I know you didn't intend to hurt me. That's actually the problem. Hurting me was so acceptable to you that it didn't require intention. It was just the natural consequence of needing something unpleasant done, and knowing I'd do it without complaint." Brandon placed a protective hand on Jessica's shoulder, his instincts as a husband overriding his growing understanding of the family dynamics at play. "Maya," he said firmly, "I think that's enough. Jessica has acknowledged that mistakes were made, and I don't see what purpose is served by continuing to relitigate past grievances on our wedding day." His defense of his wife was admirable, but it also demonstrated how quickly he'd aligned himself with the family pattern of prioritizing Jessica's comfort over accountability. Within hours of marrying into the Chen family, he was already participating in the same dynamic that had made me invisible for years. "Brandon," I said with genuine sympathy, "I understand that you want to protect Jessica, and that speaks well of you as a husband. But protecting someone from the consequences of their actions isn't actually protection, it's enabling. And your wife has been enabled by this family for so long that she genuinely doesn't understand why sending her sister to clean toilets at her wedding might be problematic." The conversation was interrupted by the approach of several other guests, including some of Denver's most prominent business leaders who had clearly been waiting for an opportunity to speak with me privately. Margaret Pemberton, the CEO of Colorado's largest private foundation, extended her hand with a warm smile. "Ms. Chen," she said, "I've been hoping for a chance to discuss your urban development work. We've been looking for investment partners who understand both the financial and social implications of community revitalization, and your approach has been getting attention in all the right circles." As I shook her hand and began discussing potential collaborations, I was aware of my family, watching from a few feet away. They were seeing me engage as an equal with people they'd spent years trying to impress, discussing projects that would shape Denver's future while they stood on the sidelines of conversations they couldn't contribute to meaningfully. The role reversal was complete. I was no longer the family member who cleaned up their messes. I was the successful professional whose attention they craved but could no longer command. And as I settled into the evening's business networking, I realized that the most satisfying revenge was simply living well enough that their approval became irrelevant. The dinner would proceed as planned. Jessica would have her perfect wedding reception, and my parents would spend the evening watching their dismissed daughter command the respect they'd always sought for themselves. But more importantly, I would never again clean another bathroom for the sake of family harmony. Some lessons, I thought as I followed Margaret toward the dining room, were worth learning in public. The dinner proceeded with the surreal quality of a play where half the actors had forgotten their lines. I found myself seated at the head table, not because anyone had planned it that way, but because Margaret Pemberton and Judge Williams had naturally gravitated toward continuing our business discussions over the elaborate 5-course meal. My parents sat 3 seats away, close enough to hear fragments of conversations about municipal bonds and development financing, far enough to feel excluded from decisions that would shape their city's future. Jessica's wedding cake cutting happened precisely on schedule, with all the traditional elements intact. She and Brandon posed for photographs, fed each other bites of raspberry-filled layers, and smiled for the crowd with practiced perfection. But I could see the strain around Jessica's eyes, the way her laugh came a beat too late, the careful distance she maintained from our parents who were still processing their spectacular miscalculation. The speeches began after dessert, starting with Judge Williams offering traditional words about love, commitment, and the joining of 2 families. His remarks were gracious, but generic, the kind of safe sentiments that worked regardless of the actual relationships involved. Brandon's best man followed with amusing stories about college adventures and professional achievements, painting a picture of a man ready for the responsibilities of marriage. Then my father stood to speak, and I felt the entire room tense with anticipation. He'd written his remarks weeks ago, back when the evening's primary goal was impressing the Williams family with the Chen family's worthiness and success. Now he faced the challenge of delivering a father-of-the-bride speech while his younger daughter, whom he'd barely acknowledged in the original toast, commanded more respect from the assembled guests than he did. Robert cleared his throat and looked out over the room with the careful expression of someone navigating a minefield. He began with safe territory, thanking the guests for attending and expressing gratitude for the Williams family's welcome. But as he moved toward discussing Jessica's accomplishments and the pride she'd brought to the family, his words began to sound hollow against the backdrop of the afternoon's revelations. "Jessica has always been our shining star," he said, his voice carrying less conviction than usual. "Her achievements have brought honor to our family name, and we couldn't be prouder of the woman she's become." The words were true but incomplete, drawing implicit contrast with a daughter whose achievements he'd learned about from strangers at her sister's wedding. He paused, seeming to wrestle with whether to acknowledge the elephant in the room or maintain the fiction that this was still the same family celebration he'd planned. My gaze met his across the room, and I saw him make a decision that surprised me with its courage. But tonight has also reminded me that pride comes in many forms, and success isn't always visible to those closest to us. The Chen family has been blessed with daughters who excel in different ways, and I'm grateful for the lessons this day has taught me about recognizing worth in all its forms. He raised his glass toward Jessica, then deliberately turned to include me in the gesture. "To our daughters, both of them, and to the futures they're building." The toast was awkward but genuine, and I found myself raising my glass in response despite everything that had happened between us. It wasn't an apology, but it was acknowledgement, and that felt like a beginning even if it wasn't an ending. As the evening progressed into dancing and socializing, I noticed how the social dynamics had completely rearranged themselves around my revealed identity. Business leaders who had politely ignored me during cocktails now sought me out for conversations about development opportunities and investment strategies. Politicians who had focused their attention on my parents earlier in the evening found reasons to discuss municipal policy and urban planning initiatives. Most tellingly, the Williams family had transformed from politely tolerant future in-laws to actively interested business partners. Judge Williams introduced me to his brother, who managed a private equity fund focused on sustainable development. Margaret Williams, Brandon's mother, mentioned her involvement with affordable housing initiatives and suggested lunch meetings to explore collaboration opportunities. I was experiencing firsthand how Denver's elite actually functioned when they encountered someone with genuine power rather than someone merely seeking access to their circles. The difference was profound and illuminating, showing me exactly what my family had been chasing and why their approach had never quite worked. Jessica found me during a quiet moment when I was standing alone on the terrace, looking out over the gardens where her ceremony had taken place hours earlier. She approached carefully, as if unsure whether I might use my newfound authority to banish her from her own wedding reception. "Maya," she said quietly, "I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about how I treated you this morning, and probably for years before that." Her voice lacked its usual confidence, and I could see her struggling with concepts that challenged everything she'd believed about our relationship. I waited for her to continue, not willing to make this conversation easier for her, but not wanting to shut it down either. We stood in silence for a moment, listening to the distant sounds of music and laughter from inside the venue. "I think I understand now why you hid your business from us," she continued. "If I'd known you were successful, I probably would have tried to take credit for it somehow, or found ways to make it about me. That's what I do, isn't it? Make everything about me." The admission was more honest than anything Jessica had ever said to me, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition that she was capable of growth if given the proper motivation. "Jessica," I said gently, "I didn't hide my success to punish you. I hid it because I needed space to become someone other than the family problem solver. Every time I've shared good news with this family, it's either been overshadowed by your achievements or turned into something I was expected to share rather than celebrate." She nodded slowly, seeming to process the pattern I was describing. "Like when you got that scholarship to business school, and Mom immediately started talking about how it would help you support my career goals. Or when you published that article, and Dad used it for his presentation without asking." Exactly, I confirmed. I needed to build something that was completely mine before I could risk sharing it with people who might try to claim it or diminish it. Tonight was supposed to be about showing you what you'd been taking for granted, not about destroying your wedding. We stood together quietly, two sisters who had spent years misunderstanding each other finally beginning to see the real shape of their relationship. The music changed inside, shifting to something slower and more romantic as the evening moved toward its conclusion. "Maya," Jessica said hesitantly, "do you think we could start over somehow? I know I can't undo the way I've treated you, but maybe we could build something different going forward." The question was complicated because it required me to decide whether I believed she was capable of the kind of fundamental change that would make a relationship possible. Looking at her in her wedding dress, humbled by the day's revelations, but still fundamentally the same person who had sent me to clean bathrooms that morning, I wasn't sure. "I think we can try," I said finally. "But it would have to be on equal terms, Jessica. I won't go back to being the sister who cleans up your messes while you get the credit. If we're going to have a relationship, it has to be between two adults who respect each other." She nodded eagerly, relief evident in her expression. "I want that, Maya. I really do. I'm not sure I know how to do it. This family has operated the same way for so long that I don't even know what equal terms would look like." Her honesty was encouraging, even if it revealed how much work would be required to rebuild trust between us. But for the first time in years, I felt like we were having a real conversation rather than performing the roles our family had assigned us. The evening concluded with traditional elements: bouquet throwing, car decorating, and fond farewells. As Jessica and Brandon departed for their honeymoon in Italy, I participated in these rituals with genuine warmth, understanding that my sister's happiness didn't diminish my own worth, and that supporting her celebration didn't require diminishing myself. As the last guest departed and the venue staff began cleaning up, Mr. Thompson approached me with final paperwork and a summary of the evening's financials. "Ms. Chen," he said with professional satisfaction, "despite the unique circumstances, the event was extremely successful. Guest feedback has been overwhelmingly positive, and several inquiries have already come in from attendees interested in booking future events." I reviewed the numbers, noting that Jessica's wedding reception had indeed been profitable for Mountain View Development Group. The irony was perfect. The event my family had used to showcase their social status had become my first revenue-generating activity as the venue's owner. My parents lingered as other guests departed, clearly wanting to have a private conversation, but uncertain how to approach their daughter, who had revealed herself to be more powerful than they'd imagined. Finally, my mother gathered her courage and walked over to where I was discussing logistics with the catering manager. "Maya," she said softly, "could we talk for a few minutes? Your father and I would like to understand what happens next, between us as a family." I finished my conversation with the catering manager and turned to face my parents, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time in my adult life. They looked older than I'd realized, more fragile, as if the evening's revelations had stripped away the confident facade they'd maintained for years. "Mom, Dad," I said, acknowledging them both with the respect I'd always shown despite how they'd treated me. "What happens next depends on whether you're willing to accept that I'm not the same person who cleaned bathrooms this morning. Not because I own a business, but because I've decided to stop accepting treatment that doesn't reflect my worth as your daughter." My father stepped forward, his business instincts finally engaging with the family relationship he'd neglected. "Maya, we'd like to invest in Mountain View Development Group. We have capital available, and we believe in what you're building." The offer was predictable, but missed the point entirely. They wanted to buy their way back into my good graces using the same approach they'd used to purchase social acceptance, throwing money at problems until they disappeared. "Dad," I said gently, "Mountain View Development Group doesn't need additional investors. But more importantly, Our family relationship can't be fixed with a business transaction. You can't invest your way out of years of treating me like hired help." Linda stepped closer, her voice carrying genuine emotion for the first time all day. "Maya, please tell us what we can do. We know we've made mistakes, and we want to make things right." The question revealed both their desperation and their fundamental misunderstanding of what had happened. They thought this was about errors in judgment that could be corrected with proper apologies and compensation. They didn't understand that it was about basic respect and recognition, things that couldn't be purchased or negotiated. "Mom," I said, "what I need from you is the same thing I've always needed, to be treated like a valued member of this family regardless of what I can do for you. That means no more cleaning up other people's messes, no more being cropped out of family photos, and no more assuming that my time and dignity are less important than Jessica's convenience." They nodded earnestly, making promises about changed behavior and renewed appreciation. But I could see in their eyes that they still didn't fully understand the depth of what had been broken between us. They thought this was about wounded feelings rather than fundamental disrespect. The conversation continued for another hour, covering logistics about future family gatherings, discussions about boundaries and expectations, and tentative plans for rebuilding relationships that had been damaged by years of neglect. It wasn't resolution, but it was a beginning, and that felt like enough for one day. As I drove home through Denver's quiet streets, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me from cleaning bathrooms to owning the venue where my sister's perfect wedding had taken place. The revenge hadn't felt like I'd imagined it would. Instead of bitter satisfaction, I felt something closer to relief, as if I'd finally stopped carrying weight I'd never agreed to bear. My phone buzzed with messages from business contacts who had attended the reception, already following up on conversations we'd started during dinner. There were meeting requests, collaboration proposals, and invitations to events where I would be welcomed as an equal rather than tolerated as a guest. But the message that meant the most came from an unexpected source. Jessica had texted from her honeymoon departure lounge. "Thank you for not ruining my wedding when you could have. No, I don't deserve your generosity, but I'm grateful for it. When I get back, I'd like to take you to lunch. Not because I need something, but because I want to know who my sister really is." I saved the message and continued driving, thinking about how power worked and what it meant to use it wisely. I'd spent years building influence and wealth while hiding in plain sight, and today had been my first real test of how to wield that power when family relationships were involved. The test wasn't about whether I could destroy people who had hurt me. Any successful person could manage that. The real test was whether I could claim my worth without diminishing others, whether I could demand respect without requiring submission, and whether I could change family dynamics without destroying family bonds entirely. As I pulled into my apartment complex, I realized that today had transformed more than just my relationship with my family. It had changed how I saw myself and what I was willing to accept going forward. I would never again clean someone else's bathroom for the sake of keeping peace, but more importantly, I would never again hide my light under a bushel to avoid challenging other people's egos. The woman who had scrubbed toilet bowls that morning was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true power came not from what you could control, but from what you refused to accept. And tomorrow, I would wake up as the owner of Riverside Manor, the CEO of Mountain View Development Group, and the sister who had finally learned the difference between being helpful and being taken advantage of. Some battles were worth fighting in public, and some victories were worth claiming regardless of who got uncomfortable in the process. The bathroom cleaning was over. The real work of building a life worthy of respect was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.